This year, 106 craftspeople entered. There were 180 pieces, and the jury selected 36. That's kind of the overall breakdown. In terms of mediums, I don't have the exact numbers. We'll be putting them in the catalog, but fibre snuck ahead of mixed media. Mixed media has been coming up throughout the past 10 years. It's just been creeping up and creeping up and creeping up. That was followed by clay and then followed by wood. So there was a pretty good representation from everything except, I think, glass, and I think the jury might talk a little bit about that. These are your two jurors, which I'm going to introduce right now, and then they can sit down. Tom said that they should have been awarded the Premier's Prize.
For endurance.
Well, I agree. These two guys just clicked, and in a record time selected the show. It gave the staff so much more opportunity to set up for the day, and they just clicked. I don't know. They just clicked. Before I introduce them, I want to thank very much Greystone Managed Investments from Regina, who is sponsoring this exhibition, big time, and beyond that has created a new award for Craft Year as well. I would very much like to thank Market Mall. This space is donated, and they've been so cooperative with us. We really appreciate that. It would be hard-pressed to find another venue. This venue was absolutely perfect. We could hang things on the wall and shelves, move things around easily. I would also like to thank Creative Saskatchewan and the Affinity Credit Union, and especially the City of Saskatoon, who this year is really helping out the Saskatchewan Craft Council with, is it a $55,000 grant to help us replace the boiler, which is springing leaks all over. June Jacobs has been active in Saskatchewan fine crafts for more than 30 years in a variety of capacities, but notably as a fibre artist. Her work is inspired by nature, and she lives and works in an environment that allows her to assimilate and reinterpret the prairie. She uses felting, hand and machine embroidery, applique, and quilting in her distinctive pieces. And her work's been exhibited all over, internationally as well. June's accomplishments are numerous. She has operated the Hand Wave Gallery for 3 decades. She's an educator, adjudicator, juror. She's active in many organizations, including the Saskatchewan Craft Council, CARFAC, the Saskatchewan Professional Art Gallery Association, Fibre Guilds, and has served as coordinator of many arts-related activities. We are very pleased to have you, June, as a juror.
Thank you.
Tom McFall, he came in late because he's still on Alberta time. Well, he thinks that he hasn't switched. Tom's been involved in many organizations as well. Too numerous to list, but here's some of them. The Canadian Conference of the Arts, the United States Craft Organization Development Association, the Alberta Cultural Action Network, the Craft Working Group for Trade Team Canada, and of course the CCF, the Canadian Crafts Federation. I think you've been involved from day one on that. As Executive Director of the Alberta Craft Council for almost 2 decades, he has helped it become one of Canada's largest and most productive craft organizations. His academic background is in industrial design and design history, and has taught both at the University of Alberta. He is a 4th-generation Albertan from a family in which everyone has been a handmaker of creative and purposeful objects. He has extensive experience in curating and jurying, as well as developing exhibitions. We are also very pleased to have you, Tom. There's one other thank you that I want to extend, and that's to all of you that participated in this exhibition. Thank you.
Thank you for coming this morning, and welcome to the process, which this is part of. Mm-hmm. So I'm just going to begin by saying it was a daunting task at first. You know, that you really were kind of overwhelmed. Like when we gave the talk on the Wednesday night, and you saw what you had to look at a glance. I mean, you were looking at things in a different way. Thought, oh my God, it is bigger than I thought it was going to be, and it is going to be daunting. But it changes. It changes when you pick things up. It changes when you hold them in your hand and you look at them from all the sides and you talk to someone as well. Then the conversation begins and you get feedback that comes back. And almost they expedite the process. Those that rise above separate themselves. Those that, for whatever reasons, say other things, separate themselves out. And there is a big middle ground that you have to converse over, but it's the conversation that's able to take place that makes the process understandable. And we really had very little discrepancy in choices. And when we thought about it, you know, there was very similar approaches to the works really spoke similarly to each of us. So that was interesting to observe on this side of it. And then the process of the conversation that takes place that encompasses the body of work that aren't so directly obvious in the choice. And that conversation, you know, develops and expands, and Tom, speak more to it maybe.
Well,
we'll share this part.
Yeah, that conversation may continue today and perhaps even into the future, because I'm interested in some, you know, bit of conversation. We've got a couple of hours this morning for some of that. Yeah, I'd like to say almost the same thing, actually, that when I first saw this vast array of stuff on Wednesday evening, I got pretty jittery. I thought, what the hell have I gotten myself into? But we started looking around, and there were things that started to pop out fairly quickly, and then we've had lots of conversation that was actually very agreeable. One other little thing I sensed the first day was that I actually wanted to go shopping because there were some very appealing things in this room, and we'll see. Our process was to, we spent about an hour alone each, maybe almost 2 hours, looking at everything, looking at each one piece by piece. We started at opposite sides of the room so that we weren't tempted to meet in the center and not get any further. And that helped a lot because it was just the calm time to give some serious thought to things. And then we started, we did a kind of an early rating, kind of yes, maybe, no, question marks, and other thoughts. Then we did much of the same thing. Oh, then we sat down for lunch and we went through our earliest personal assumptions, and then we started working around again and basically talking through everything. And there was actually surprisingly little disagreement. There was a little bit of negotiation on, for instance, if there were 2 or 3 pieces submitted by one person, whether we would have 1 or 2 and which the one might be. There were a few other things that each of us was puzzled about a little bit. I mean, I have a different material expertise than June does, and there were some things that I was kind of curious about. There were even some cultural things that I was curious about, like whether this is something that's uniquely original in Saskatchewan, or maybe it's just something that's a little weird, and we would talk about things like that. But altogether, although it was a lot of hard work for, you know, basically a full day and a half of conversation to select the exhibition first, and then to select the awards, which we can't tell you about yet, even though that would be pretty exciting. I would say that we initially didn't agree on perhaps 10% of the variation, and by the end of it we were in full agreement on everything, except a little bit of frustration about how, well, wouldn't it be nicer if it was 45 pieces in this exhibition rather than 35?
And I also want to say too, you know, I mean, I've been around the Craft Council a long time. I mean, I started in '79 as the coordinator of this exhibition and the market in 1979. So I've seen a lot of the artists. I mean, even though I don't say anything, you know, you've seen a lot of the artists develop their work over the years and if their work is submitted. I mean, I wasn't stumped very much by who was doing what, but I had to keep it zipped until Tom had some conclusions drawn on those pieces. Like, I mean, because it's supposed to be a blind jury. Well, like, I mean, I would be lying if I said that I didn't know who was making things. It was not possible for me. But I didn't say it until Tom had some sort of decision or something that then, you know, had led or made a decision that, you know, it was either yes or no or whatever, that discussion. So I tried not to influence his observations. And so that was, I felt, important, and that I didn't really, you know, I better behave. And it was hard sometimes. It was hard not to say something, or that it came out almost, you know, automatically. And Judy would remind me, remember, June, you can't say anything. So that, you know, to keep that idea is that it's as blind as it can be. You know, I can't excuse myself for the knowledge that you have, but hopefully you're true and fair to the piece when you look at them, and that you give the credence that the work deserves without the baggage of the maker that comes with those pieces. I mean, it may not be baggage, it's just the knowledge of that artist's work. So I don't know if that helped it, but I mean, even all in the end, again, there was very little discrepancy of what choices we had made, and that was I mean, I found it even interesting that would be so.
Well, and this is an inherent challenge for this kind of process, because the work that I would be looking for, I think we were both looking for most of the time, was that work which was the most distinctive. So it makes it easier to recognize the people who do that most distinctive work. That's really the point. So there were a few people who I thought I recognized, people who I even recognized from national or other projects. At least I recognized their work, and sometimes I didn't know their names, but still had some you know, accidental familiarity. I don't think that ever affected anything that we discussed, except one thing, which is maybe just something to think about in the future. We had a couple of not serious but short conversations in which I asked a question, usually of June, about whether this might be the work of somebody who I recognized as being well established in the field, or whether it might accidentally be good work by one of their students. So that posed a bit of a problem for me. So that, if you're an instructor, that might be something to think about, because there is always some potential for some confusion about that. There's always a chance that even one of your introductory students can actually pull off something that looks to an outsider to be the same as your own work. That's another challenge in terms of, you know, approach to education. But that was really the only time when I needed a little bit of extra sort of insider knowledge, just to be sure that this wasn't an accidental newcomer compared to somebody who was well known for the work.
And that, I mean, I don't think we want to say that eliminated a work because it was made possibly by a student. It's just that it helps in the discourse of the discussion. Is this like a one-off thing that's very similar? Or is this bringing with it the breadth of knowledge that the artist brings when they're creating work and translates in the pieces that you see? So it was there as part of that discussion.
So we have, what have we got, 7 maybe themes that we thought we would talk about a little bit. And I think we'll just talk about them, and then in half an hour or so we'll kind of stir up some lively conversation if we can. And these are not about particular pieces, although we might use some pieces behind us as an example of the idea. But these are just ideas that we kept track of as part of our discussion, or even something we thought of at midnight or 2 o'clock in the morning. Not that we were together at 2 o'clock in the morning, but it could have happened then. Some good things happen at 2 o'clock in the morning, and ideas are one of them. The first thing that we talked, I'm just going to jump into the first one, then you can pick up right after. The first one is, it's kind of a big theme. not so much just to this exhibition, but even to the art of making. It's fairly easy for us to spot the pieces that are young, sort of immature, not, in need of resolution, need of a lot more work, in need of the 10,000 hour kind of thing. So it was fairly apparent to us that there were a few things here that might have been almost the first thing that somebody had done. And we want to encourage that kind of activity, but it does stand out as being, not ready for a major exhibition and major tour, and not really suitable to a big award, for instance, unless it happened to be an emerging award. We also saw a few pieces which I kind of slightly rudely refer to as the Mona Lisa effect. And that's where somebody has spent far too much time on a single piece, maybe over weeks or even years, and they've just been almost preoccupied by it. And that usually stands out, usually first of all because it might be overworked, sometimes because it introduces a question about whether this is a one-off piece or whether it does fit into a body of work. And of course we weren't able to see bodies of work, so we weren't entirely sure about that. But these are both things to keep in mind any time, and especially when you're thinking of what you might enter into a prominent competition like this, or maybe talking to a curator or another jury or wherever, is to different media require I'm just trying to get the right idea here. Depending on the medium, there are points of accomplishment and points of no return. And if you've ever done any potting, especially if you're a professional at that, you know when you've overthrown a pot and you dump it. You just get rid of it. The same thing happens in sketching. If you're out doing, plein air drawing or something like that, once in a while you throw it away because it's just gone too far. It's not working. It doesn't work. It's not going to be fixable. I think you could say that for almost all of these things, but there is an inclination in some material and some processes to just continue thinking that it might get better, and maybe something will happen eventually, and that is not usually the case. So I'm not going to use any of these as examples here, but other examples are amateur woodworkers have a tendency to use too many materials in one piece of furniture, for example, and it can be visually overworked. But sometimes they also have a tendency to use too many joints in one piece of furniture, and that can be overworked as well. So you can take that sort of idea and run it almost through every medium. So we could tell quite quickly what were the kind of the new and the amateur pieces, and we could tell quite quickly what were the Mona Lisa pieces which had been overworked, and just because they had a lot of time didn't actually belong in an exhibition like this. So food for thought, really.
Yeah, exactly. And then we spent a lot of, and I guess that sort of aspect played a lot into looking at things that were really innovative, and whether it was innovative from a material point of view or innovative from an idea, innovative from a political statement, innovative from, it brought in lots of discourse, and directly related to intent. And then sort of on the opposite side, did it, sometimes it was in novelty. I mean, it really put it in that, almost in that category, and you wondered about the intent. And that directive, that is where discourse was spent, was the intent of the work and the intent of the artist, and got lost in the piece and took it from one area where it worked to another that it didn't. And it's only in its unresolved in the work. And that can then also can be said too about the purpose of something, the intent versus the function. I mean, there are more purposeful ways of looking at something rather than only through its function. And that discussion took a lot of, because the function, the direct function may be obvious, but the purposefulness of the object led it somewhere else. And that played in the discussion of lots of works as well. Do we want to cite any examples here? Do you want to?
on the innovation, this is also medium specific, and
Right.
it can also apply to some very traditional activity as well as what we might think is more contemporary. So one of my favorite pieces was the prairie plaid blanket back here, which might be a little hard to think of as being innovative because it's a superbly traditional piece of weaving. It's perfect, basically. But the innovation for me was to see the landscape of Saskatchewan, at least to certain seasons, caught so spectacularly well in a very traditional piece of work. So
Yeah.
the innovation on that was simply the arrangement of color, the tonal values, and I actually don't know whether any of this was hand dyeing. It might be, but whether or not, it's just spectacularly innovative on the color account, even though you might think of this as being a very traditional piece of work. And to my mind, that's as good as any photograph or piece of poetry about capturing some aspect of Saskatchewan.
Mm.
There was one other where it's difficult to talk about the unsuccessful pieces just in case somebody ends up in tears, and that's never the intent.
No.
This is for advice and growth and whatever. There was one other that we picked out where it was a combination of being overworked and an element of novelty which actually ruined the piece. And it's a couple of hand starfish-shaped things in soapstone, one textured and one polished, which as an object is really appealing, does lots of things. But it fell apart because somebody didn't know when to stop with the object and continued on with a mirror underneath and a decorative frame treatment beyond it. And if we had been able to take that piece of stone off the base, it might have been in the exhibition. But because we had to look at it as presented, we thought this could be a really nice piece of work, perhaps to sell at a Christmas craft sale, and somebody would be happy to take it home for their bedroom or wherever else. And this is a really nicely developing idea, theme, accomplished work. But to put the two of them together was just 100% overkill. And there would have been a few other examples of that. There were a couple of other examples where some aspect of the work was coming along pretty well, but then something else came in, like the base was wrong, or there was some element of finish that was wrong, or something that should have been a ceramic finish ended up being in a paint finish, or something like that, where they didn't actually come together as an object. But that was a particularly strong example of where, if that was a student of mine, I would say, you were ahead back
Before.
whatever number of hours or days or stages in the process. And the best advice I could give to that person as an instructor, or even here, is that you were way further ahead earlier on, and you need some way to figure out how to do that, and maybe somebody who can help you figure out how to do that.
And to put the brakes on and know when to stop, because sometimes more is less, and less is better. You know, it translates. You know, less becomes more, and presentation. And I think that also is how the works were made to be seen and how they presented themselves, and that had a kind of a deterrent on the piece you really were making. So it's how you presented it, and I mean that's always, you know, the issue. You spend all the time on the body of work, on the work, and then all of a sudden it has to be presented a certain way. How is it going to be seen? And not equal time. You can tell not equal time is thought about how it's going to be viewed, and how it's going to be seen, how it's going to be positioned, how it's going to be, what base you're going to put it on. You know, that took away from the individual work, and I think that almost is as much consideration. I mean, and I know I'm guilty of the same thing. You're working towards a deadline, and all of a sudden you got to have it on a base. Like, how is it going to stand, or how are you going to present it? But it's not equal as the amount of time that's presented with the work. You know, you spend all this time and energy getting it there, and then it falls short. And it's sometimes left on the table for that very reason, and not because the work isn't good.
And we know quite a bit about this experience because we both had it numerous times.
Yeah.
Another one is about purpose and function. There's this kind of cliche out there that, oh, craft is always functional and art is always something else, and it's all hooey. In fact, there was an interview on Peter Zosky maybe 30 years ago in which somebody described art as being something you piss on and craft as being something you piss in. But
What's a vase compared to a vase?
oh, I hadn't heard this one.
Yeah.
What's the same thing?
Okay,
So
right.
Robin Hoppers.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, who knows the origin of that? It's probably ancient English somewhere, or Old English. So we wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of purpose and how that's different from function. And I want to start with an example, actually. Back here, there's a set of 5 little goblet-like objects, which are not functional, but are highly purposeful. The difference being that if these were only functional, we would have to be sure that they could hold a martini, which is a great idea. But
And you would have had to try that out.
that's right. We would have had to test them probably all day. But the purpose of these is to take something like a martini glass or references to other
Vessel
imbibing
forms.
and,
Yeah.
and vessels and turn them into something which, well, there are several purposes. One is experimentation, one is surface treatment, but the principal purpose in my mind of this was to say something about celebration. And this combination of objects and materials and other things seem to come together really well. And these are just dancing with the delight of celebration. And that's their purpose, but it's not their function. There were other things where we talked about how there might be some function or some residual function, but they hadn't quite reached the purpose stage because they weren't really saying very much to us. We thought, well, maybe they would hold water, or maybe you can sit on it, or maybe you can wrap it around you, but that doesn't really, it's not quite, these particular pieces are not quite transcending the idea of function into this much bigger and more creative idea of purpose. The purpose being what you're going to say about it, why you're doing it, why it's innovative, why it's challenging, why it would stand out in a milieu for being the only one of its kind maybe anywhere. Those are all interesting purpose aspects.
Okay, so then let's move on to accomplishment and technical skill.
It's quite common, especially in guild-type settings, which are focused more on the learning of how, rather than maybe the exploration of why. Not that guilds can't do that, not that there's anything wrong with guilds, but in many instances somebody joins a guild because they want to learn how to do something, throw pots or whatever. And those are primarily technical concerns to begin with, and you need certain levels of mastery in order to get more creative. But you'll still find I hope I don't insult anybody with this idea, but in some guild settings, such as a quilter's guild, you'll see all sorts of people turning the quilt over to see whether the stitching is properly done on the back. Well, that's important in a guild setting, but in a setting like this, we would be much more interested in what the quilt was actually saying and how it was doing that and how original it was than turning it over to see whether it was properly stitched. So the stitching is interesting enough, but then it moves on to a whole bunch of ideas that are
that are there. I mean, and that's where the piece speaks. I mean, I even know that Dimensions has always sort of prided itself on that technical skill level of artistry and craftsman, and that translates through, again, the pieces that are worked for the 100 hours because that makes them better. Or you've got 100 hours, and therefore, the piece has somehow moved from in skill level. But it still leaves you in what you actually accomplished, what the piece really say, other than the time that was spent on it. And as the work, as you view the works, you can see where the hours aren't the only important thing, and the skill level isn't the only thing. It is the message. It is the story. It is the combination of those that make the work speak. And so it's not only, you can't really look at the piece only in isolation of its technical skill level or its accomplishment. It leads, it leads and it translates.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes technique is a really important part of it, like with this sensational guitar behind me. And there are other instances where technique is entirely different, and accomplishment becomes, well, I mean, accomplishment is there with the guitar certainly, but another one is this, there's a woven piece right behind which is called I think it's called iCompost. And the surface treatment, the color effect, all of that is very random, happenstantial. It seems to involve pieces of scrap steel and berries and a bunch of other things that have generated all of this. So you can't actually say that there's any particular technique about, I don't know, throwing berries onto fabric like this, but it works really well. So if we were to look at this simply from a technique perspective, somebody from a more kind of a technique perspective might say, oh, she doesn't have very much control over that, does she? Well, that's actually the point. So the accomplishment aspect of that is not the technique or the skill control. The accomplishment aspect of that one is what an amazing effect can be got out of something that is a really random and uncontrollable kind of process. That's where the accomplishment comes beyond just the technique aspect of it.
Yeah. And also, I mean, having the knowledge that knowing that what the randomness or what the freedom will add to that piece, that's technically well done and executed as a woven piece. What letting the freedom come through the randomness of the dyeing is what gives it, is what the message is, and what makes this piece sing.
And I might add that I think that the risk factor in that, I mean, we're familiar with this with things like raku, but it applies to all sorts of other material and media. The risk element is sometimes what results in some of the final energy in the piece. So if that was perfectly controlled, it would probably be a lot less interesting than because because now, sorry, what am I trying to say? I can't finish that sentence. Instead of now, this piece is actually expressing its risk, its creative urge, and that'll pass on. And you can actually see that in a variety of other instances where, I mean, you might be able to line up 5 things that are, I mean, more or less the same, and there will be 2 or 3 of them that stand out, because there's something about this accomplishment that I don't know, it's a je ne sais quoi. But anyway, enough on that point.
Yeah. And now
it's a je ne sais quoi. Let's move on.
And then there's the idea of when to push something further and when, well, and I guess we have already addressed it in some regard, but that became obvious in some of the pieces of why you made it, and if you made it, what was the, the purpose again, and the intent and the story, and beyond technique and traffic, what was the story that went with this piece? And that was the question that we often asked of individual pieces. So why was this done? Like, what was the intent here? And that played a lot into a lot of the individual pieces. And then you rediscuss it in all of those other things, in the materials and the skill level, and was it traditional or contemporary? Like, what is feeding this piece to tell its story? To know what its intent was and why it was made. And so that was a conversation we also had a lot about pieces.
And there's sort of a few other thoughts about that, and they're all kind of negative, but they're informational somehow, these ideas, these examples. There's some value in learning from your instructors and mentors by replicating aspects of their work, but there's a lot more value in moving to a different territory beyond that as quickly as possible, because just doing it the same as somebody else is not enough to make it to be pushing edges, or to bring it to this level of accomplishment, or to give it this new, broader idea of purpose. Likewise, always thinking about challenging conventions. Here's one that I notice quite a bit in the furniture scene, which is more wood than furniture much of the time. There's an angst about ever adding plastics or paint to contemporary craft furniture. And I sort of figure, well, why not? Why have we got this aversion to paint when it could be a really interesting opportunity? So that's a convention that could be pushed. And I would say that, right away, if somebody who's working in furniture, thinking out of the box in terms of conventional hardwoods and thinking into salvage materials and paints and other surfaces, would all of a sudden give you a whole additional range of material opportunities, but creative opportunities as well, just by saying, okay, I'm breaking the conventions, whatever my conventions are.
Yeah.
Again, breaking the conventions with purpose. Just being contrary, you'd end up being like me. But knowing how to break your traditions, or not traditions, how to push your traditions, how to break the conventions. Traditions are much better than conventions in my mind, because traditions are richer and more easily understood in a variety of ways. But to challenge the conventions all the time is useful and interesting. How did we get onto that?
I don't know how we did,
Okay.
but it's there.
Pushing further, that's
Pushing
it.
further.
Yeah.
Well, you know, and recognizing, you know, especially when you handled pieces, you saw right away where things could have been pushed further. You know, oh, what if they would have done this, and what if they would have done this with this piece, and where it could have gone instead of where it is. And knowing sometimes that some pieces can allow to be pushed further and would have said more, versus stopped because of that was the skill that you learned and that's what you knew, or that's what was dictated by this, you know, by, I don't know, by finishing the work, rather than the piece saying, oh, you know, I could have, it could lead you further. And so it's knowing when things can be pushed and knowing when to stop. That was another consideration that we applied to lots of the works.
So if we were talking about this in one of your studios somewhere, we might be saying, push, stop, push, stop, push, stop. So,
Yeah.
but that's part of the creative process.
Yeah. Marrying of materials, that was also interesting, you know, to see in works where they use something else to you know, maybe another material they weren't as familiar with, and married them in the same piece. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. I'm trying to figure out if there's anything here we chose it. Yes.
Yeah.
You know.
And the ceramic piece above would be.
And the ceramic pieces above, where you're marrying plastics and ceramics, you're marrying glass and metal, you're marrying techniques. And that might have to do with the inspiration that comes from a work, and knowing that, well, it has to be other materials. It's not going to translate. And I think I see it more in textiles, where sometimes it's so driven, you know, that maybe sometimes it isn't always best answered in one material, and maybe you need to explore another, or sometimes you need the reverse, you need to pull back, and maybe it's only to be said in one, you know, and that applied to lots of objects that we looked at.
And some of these were as simple as a base that didn't work with the object.
Yeah.
They were usually, looked like they were bases that were done by somebody else, or were an add-on, or, you know, an afterthought. Yeah. I mean, it's one thing for picture frames because there are functional purposes to those, but even then a picture frame can enhance or detract from an object within the frame. But there were several examples of where the add-on bases, sometimes done by somebody else, were a significant detractor to the object. And even if the object needed to be presented somewhere other than on its own, I mean, maybe it should have been hung, or maybe something else should have been done with it, but just sticking it on a base was not the solution.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, there are two, and again, I don't want to insult anybody personally, but there were a couple of raku pieces that had kind of roughly done twisty steel, and actually both of those would have been much more interesting if they had been treated so that they could be hung, for example, or maybe even become wall pieces or something, instead of just having these last-minute bases added to them.
Yep.
That's an example where without redesigning it for somebody, I think one of the first things to do with that would be to figure out whether it could be hung well. Because that's how you would see that thing if it was real, or even as that object. It wants to be out in motion, floating in water or floating in air or something. So you would, it's just sort of conceptually inconsistent to think, well, that would ever appear anywhere just stuck on something. And even if it ever did appear just stuck on something, without, you know, appearing dead or whatever, then it could be a better resolved base if there was any base at all. There was a couple more thoughts that are in our jurors' statement in the catalog as well. The first one was that we were a bit surprised that there wasn't much jewelry in the exhibition. There were a few pieces that were really good, but not a lot. There was very little glass. There was a bit of cast glass and a bit of fused glass, but we thought there would be more of that. There were only two pieces of furniture, which surprised me, knowing what I know about the wood scene in Saskatchewan. I thought there would be more. So More of an observation,
Yeah.
not really a disappointment, because there was more than enough to choose from. But there were still some gaps in submissions. So
Yep.
if you know somebody who wasn't participating in one of those media, maybe talk to them about it.
Right, I mean, because it takes another, it's 2 years again. It's not like, you're not going to be working and making, but, it's an opportunity, it's great exposure for work if they're selected, because this exhibition travels. And if there's an opportunity, I know sometimes it means that they're not saleable out of your studio because they're locked they're locked up in an exhibition. But I mean, I think you have to weigh that to the public exposure it gets. And that's great exposure for work. So I mean, just in terms of where there are vacancies of submissions was noticeable.
And I'll continue a bit on that, because now I'm talking to the people who are not here. There is sometimes some hesitation about participating in something like this, because there's always an element of risk, and you're really hoping that you might be able to sell it instead. But we were talking about this yesterday, about several people who were noticeably not in this exhibition, and why that might be. And one thing led on to another in this conversation. We started thinking, well, maybe they chose to not enter because maybe they do have, customers waiting for work, or maybe they've got a commission coming up, and maybe it wasn't quite the right timing for them, or whatever. And those are all okay if they're reasons, but not if they're excuses. On the other hand, there's a significant amount of award money right here on the table, which we can't tell you about, we're told. But a lot of money. There's a long history of pieces that are selected for high-profile exhibitions, especially tours like this, where it can actually tangibly increase the value of the work. So if there's something in this exhibition that's out on tour for several years, at least there's some artist fees involved in it, but there's a pretty good chance that it should be worth at least 25% and maybe 50% more by the time it comes back. There's also a pretty good chance that you could remarket the piece because it has toured for 2 or 3 years and has been to all these other places and had media coverage and so forth. And even literally, you can get to the point where you could put together a little package. I mean, I'm just going to use this necklace back here as an example. By the time that gets back, part of the marketing package that goes along with that necklace should be a little portfolio of the media coverage and the catalog from the exhibition. And that will simply add enough value to this that it starts to offset the potential immediate loss of revenue by not participating, or that you might think comes from what am I trying to say? There's an offset in here. There are definitely
accumulating air miles.
That's right. There is although I can't finish most sentences today, it seems there is tangible benefit in intangible things like participating in exhibitions like this. They can be awards, they can be sales, they can be career profile building, they can be reputation back at home, and even people who say, oh, am I ever glad I bought one of those last year, because look at how much more they're worth now because this person received a Dimensions Award or whatever.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yes,
right.
right.
Yes, Carmen.
Yeah.
I should have noticed that. Always the marketer. Yes, they're also for sale. We had a big international tour that started about nearly 10 years ago and went on for about 4 years. We sold everything out of that exhibition eventually, primarily to prominent collectors, some in the U.S. and also to the provincial government art collection in Alberta. So it took a while, but everything in the show went into locations like that.